What if I told you that the men who shaped the most powerful nation on earth carried secrets so uncomfortable that textbooks simply left them out? Not conspiracy theories, not rumors passed around the internet at midnight, documented facts, declassified records, congressional testimony, presidential library archives that sat untouched for decades until someone finally went looking. We learn about the founding fathers with reverence. We learn about wartime presidents as heroes. We learn about the office itself as something almost sacred, and some of that is earned. But there's another history running quietly underneath the one they taught you in school. A history of decisions made behind closed doors, of policies that never made the history test, of moments where the gap between what was said publicly and what was actually happening was wide enough to drive a country through. That's what tonight is about. 50 facts about American presidents and the administrations they led that were buried in classified files, sealed in presidential libraries, or simply never made it into the curriculum. Some of these involve documents from the National Archives. Some came through Freedom of Information Act requests. Some only became known because a congressional investigation pulled them into the light. Where the record is contested, we'll tell you it's contested. Where historians still disagree, we'll say so. The goal here isn't outrage, it's accuracy. And accuracy, it turns out, is more unsettling than any theory. Before we begin, do me a favor. Hit subscribe and give this video a like. Sleep history content doesn't exactly get pushed by the algorithm, and I need your help making sure these stories actually reach people who want to hear them. Now get comfortable, lower the lights, let this wash over you slowly, because we're going to move through 2.5 centuries of American history, from the early republic all the way to the late 20th century, and we're going to do it calmly, carefully, and honestly. 50 items, all documented, all real, all the kind of thing that makes you pause and reconsider what you thought you knew about the presidency. We begin at the very beginning, with the man on the $1 bill, with a general who became a symbol, and with a fact about his estate that historians have documented extensively but that rarely makes it into the classroom conversation about who George Washington actually was and what his legacy actually cost. 1. George Washington is remembered as the general who gave up power, the president who set precedents, the man who could have been a king and chose not to be. That version of Washington is real, and it coexists with another version that the same historical record documents just as clearly. Washington enslaved 317 people at Mount Vernon. Among them was a young woman named Ona Judge, who had served in the presidential household in Philadelphia. In 1796, she walked out of that household and boarded a ship to New Hampshire. She was in her early 20s. She had never been charged with a crime. She wanted to be free. When Washington found out, he didn't let it go. He contacted the Treasury Department. He worked through private contacts in New Hampshire to locate her and arrange her return. He tried multiple times over several years. Ona Judge gave interviews late in her life to abolitionist newspapers, and those interviews are still available. She said she knew she would be given away as a gift after Washington died. She said she left because she wanted liberty. Washington's pursuit of her is documented in his own letters, held at the Library of Congress. He never recovered her. She died free in 1848. That fact about the first president doesn't cancel the other facts, but it belongs in the same sentence with them. 2. The second president rarely gets the dramatic treatment that Washington and Jefferson receive, but John Adams made a decision in 1798 that deserves far more attention than it typically gets. With the country locked in an undeclared naval conflict with France, known as the Quasi-War, Congress passed, and Adams signed 4 laws collectively called the Alien and Sedition Acts. The most controversial was the Sedition Act, which made it a criminal offense to publish what the law described as false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government or its officials. In practice, that meant criticism of the Adams administration could land you in prison. And it did. At least 25 people were arrested. Several newspaper editors were convicted and jailed. Matthew Lyon, a congressman from Vermont, was sentenced to 4 months in prison for a letter he wrote criticizing Adams's foreign policy. He ran for re-election from his jail cell and won. Jefferson and Madison responded by drafting the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, arguing the laws were unconstitutional. The Sedition Act expired in 1801. Adams never fully reconciled his support for those laws with his own writings on liberty. Historians still debate how to hold both things at once. 3. Thomas Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal. He also enslaved over 600 people during his lifetime, never freeing the vast majority of them even upon his death. Among those he enslaved was Sally Hemings, and the question of their relationship has moved from rumor to something harder to dismiss. In 1998, a study published in the journal Nature found that a Jefferson male Y chromosome haplotype matched the patrilineal descendants of Eston Hemings, Sally Hemings' youngest son. The study also ruled out the Carr nephews, who had long been offered as an alternative explanation. A minority report from the Thomas Jefferson Heritage Society still disputes Thomas Jefferson's personal paternity, arguing another Jefferson male could be responsible. The Monticello Foundation reviewed the full body of evidence and concluded the weight of the record points to Thomas Jefferson. That conclusion is contested by some, accepted by most historians, and grounded in both genetic and documentary evidence. 4. James Madison is remembered as the father of the Constitution, the careful thinker who helped design checks and balances, but when it came to his own presidency, a lot of what he did during the War of 1812 was literally burned. In August 1814, when British forces marched into Washington, they torched the Capitol, the President's House, and multiple federal buildings, including the War Department. Inside those offices were wartime letters, orders, and administrative records that documented decisions Madison and his cabinet made as the country's capital fell. Many of those papers were never copied. They simply disappeared into smoke. Archivists and historians working with the National Archives and the Library of Congress have spent 2 centuries trying to reconstruct Madison's wartime administration from stray copies, private correspondence, newspapers, and later compilations printed in the 19th century. We have fragments of cabinet discussions, partial order books, and second-hand accounts instead of a complete official record. That loss matters. It makes it harder to answer basic questions about who proposed what, when, and why, as the United States fought and badly mismanaged a war on its own soil. The president who helped design a government of written laws and recorded debates left behind a presidency whose key military records were turned to ash. 5. James Monroe is often associated with the Monroe Doctrine, a calm-sounding warning against European meddling in the Americas. But his presidency also backed something much less tidy: Andrew Jackson's legally shaky rampage in Spanish Florida. During the First Seminole War in 1818, General Jackson invaded Spanish territory without a formal declaration of war, seized forts, and ordered the execution of 2 British subjects, Alexander Arbuthnot and Robert Ambrister, after military proceedings that even some of Jackson's contemporaries thought were dubious. Congressional debates recorded in the Annals of Congress show lawmakers arguing over whether Jackson had exceeded his orders, violated international law, and risked dragging the United States into conflict with Spain and Britain. Behind the scenes, Monroe's cabinet was split, with John Quincy Adams pressing for a hard public defense of Jackson while others urged censure. In the end, Monroe chose to stand behind Jackson, sending Congress a message that framed the incursions as defensive and the executions as justified by the fog of frontier war. Spain, already weakened, eventually ceded Florida in the Adams-Onis Treaty. The episode boosted Jackson's national fame while normalizing a pattern, a president retrospectively endorsing a general's overreach, stretching legal limits, and then folding the results into American territory. 6. John Quincy Adams enters most textbooks as the diplomat who negotiated treaties and dreamed of national universities and observatories, but he began his presidency under a cloud he never escaped. In the 1824 election, no candidate won an electoral college majority, so under the Constitution, the decision went to the House of Representatives, with each state delegation casting 1 vote. Adams trailed Andrew Jackson in both popular and electoral votes, yet after intense lobbying, the House chose Adams. When Adams soon appointed Henry Clay, the powerful Speaker of the House who had thrown his support behind him, as Secretary of State, Jackson's supporters cried foul. They called it a corrupt bargain, accusing Adams and Clay of trading the presidency for a cabinet post in a smoke-filled deal that betrayed the voters. Formal investigations and later historical work, including studies cited by the Miller Center and congressional historians, have never produced direct documentary proof of an explicit bargain, only circumstantial timing and overlapping interests. But politics runs on perception as much as paper. Jackson's allies used the charge relentlessly, painting Adams as an illegitimate president installed by elites in defiance of the people's will. For 4 years, every policy fight he waged from tariffs to internal improvements unfolded under that suspicion, weakening his coalition and helping Jackson crush him in the 1828 rematch. 7. Andrew Jackson's public image leans on rugged frontiersman myths and tough on-crime slogans, but the archival paper trail he left behind includes something far more literal and brutal, an advertisement he personally placed offering a cash bonus if an enslaved man were whipped. In 1804, while he was a rising Tennessee planter and politician, Jackson ran a notice in the Tennessee Gazette seeking the capture of an enslaved man named Tom who had escaped from his plantation. Copies of that ad survive in the Library of Congress and State Historical Society collections. Jackson described Tom in transactional detail, listed the routes he might take, and then added a line promising $10 extra for every 100 lashes any person will give him, to the amount of 300. That wasn't a clerk's phrasing or some anonymous overseer's threat. It was signed in Jackson's own name, the same man who would later become the 7th president and be celebrated on the $20 bill. Defenders sometimes argue that such ads were common in slave states and reflect the norms of the time rather than unique cruelty, and it's true that violent language appears routinely in antebellum runaway notices preserved in state archives. But the specific incentive for up to 300 lashes, effectively near-lethal torture, spelled out in print, shows how routine, codified, and monetized extreme violence against enslaved people could be in the hands of someone who would go on to hold the highest office in the country. Schoolbook portraits usually condense Jackson into a caricature of democracy's champion, Old Hickory standing firm against elites. They rarely mention that the same man once offered a bounty for each 100 strokes of a whip laid on another human being's back. 8. Andrew Jackson's presidency is often packaged in textbooks as the age of the common man, an era of expanding white male suffrage and plainspoken politics, but at the heart of his administration sat a deliberate policy of dispossession that tore apart entire native nations, even when the law said otherwise. Jackson pushed hard for the Indian Removal Act of 1830, a piece of legislation you can still read in the statutes at large, authorizing the president to negotiate treaties to relocate indigenous peoples east of the Mississippi to lands farther west. Supporters in Congress framed it as voluntary and benevolent, a way to avoid frontier conflict, yet debates recorded in the Congressional Globe and memorials sent by missionaries and native leaders show repeated warnings about coerced agreements, fraudulent land cessions, and the humanitarian disaster everyone could see coming. The Cherokee Nation took their case to the Supreme Court, and in Worcester v. Georgia in 1832, Chief Justice John Marshall's opinion recognized tribal sovereignty and held that Georgia's attempts to impose state law on Cherokee land were unconstitutional. That ruling, preserved in United States reports, undercut the legal basis for forced removal, but Jackson's administration and allied state officials largely ignored it in practice. Accounts from the National Archives and the Cherokee Nation's own records describe how, under Jackson and his successor Martin Van Buren, U.S. officials used pressure, factional divisions, and military force to drive the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole from their homelands, culminating in the deadly marches now remembered as the Trail of Tears. Thousands died from exposure, starvation, and disease along routes mapped out in War Department orders. The president, celebrated in some histories as a populist reformer, presided over, and actively advanced, a removal regime that uprooted communities who had won legal recognition but not the political power to make that recognition matter on the ground. 9. Martin Van Buren is usually introduced as Jackson's political heir and the architect of modern party organization, a smoother operator than his mentor. But one of the most revealing episodes of his presidency unfolded not in a voting booth, but in a courtroom and a harbor, over the fate of dozens of Africans who had seized control of the Spanish slave ship Amistad. In 1839, the schooner was captured off the U.S. coast and towed into Connecticut. The people on board, primarily Mende from West Africa, had been kidnapped in violation of international treaties that the United States officially recognized, but they were still claimed as property by Spanish owners. Court records and diplomatic correspondence preserved in the National Archives show how Van Buren's administration sided with Spain, directing federal attorneys to argue that the captives should be treated as legally held slaves and returned under an 1795 treaty, rather than as free individuals illegally trafficked and entitled to liberation. The president even ordered a naval vessel prepared to whisk the Africans away to Cuba quickly if the lower courts ruled against them, hoping to avoid domestic abolitionist protests and foreign policy friction. Contemporary newspapers and later analysis in the Miller Center profiles note how closely the White House watched the case. Van Buren's government insisted it was merely honoring treaty obligations and maintaining good relations, but abolitionists and some judges saw a choice: uphold a diplomatic reading that treated human beings as cargo, or recognize that kidnapping and illegal sale voided any claim of ownership. In 1841, long after Van Buren left office, the Supreme Court in United States v. the Amistad ruled that the captives had been illegally enslaved and were free, a decision that cut directly against the position his administration had championed. The Amistad episode is often told today as a courtroom victory for justice, but in the presidential papers it also stands as an example of a sitting president using federal power to try to enforce the claims of a foreign slave system over the liberty of people who had already risked everything to free themselves. 10. William Henry Harrison's death is usually summed up as a simple morality tale about stubbornness and bad weather. The president who gave a long inaugural address in the cold without a coat, caught pneumonia and died a month later, but historians and medical researchers have been quietly poking at that story using a different kind of evidence than the old anecdote. Contemporary accounts from 1841, including the attending physician's notes and newspaper reports, do describe respiratory symptoms, but they also mention severe gastrointestinal problems, confusion, and a timeline that doesn't match the idea of a cold immediately turning into fatal pneumonia. In 2014, two infectious disease specialists published an article in Clinical Infectious Diseases that re-examined those primary sources alongside what we now know about Washington's early 19th century sanitation, especially the placement of the White House water supply downstream from sewage-contaminated marshes documented in municipal engineering records. They argued that Harrison's symptoms, delayed onset and rapid decline, fit better with enteric fever, an infection like typhoid caused by contaminated water, than with a straightforward case of pneumonia contracted on Inauguration Day, and they noted that chronic citywide problems with privies and drainage would have made the presidential residence particularly risky. The researchers couldn't run lab tests or autopsies, since none were done at the time, and they stressed that their diagnosis was necessarily retrospective and probabilistic, not a firm medical finding. Other scholars cautioned that 19th century terminology was imprecise and that respiratory and enteric illnesses often overlapped in crowded cities. Still, the paper, which drew on medical journals, Harrison's own doctor's statements preserved in the National Archives, and period maps of Washington's water system, shows that even this supposedly simple story about the shortest presidency may actually be tied to a broader, less comfortable reality. Early American presidents lived in a capital where elite status did not protect you from the consequences of poor public sanitation, and the official narrative of a patriotic cold turning into pneumonia might have had more to do with Victorian sensibilities than with what actually killed him. 11. John Tyler tends to drift through survey textbooks as an accidental president, the vice president who inherited the office when Harrison died and fought with his own party. But one of his quietest yet most consequential moves involved deliberately bending the usual constitutional pathway to absorb an independent republic into the United States. In the early 1840s, the Republic of Texas was a sovereign state recognized by several countries, and when Tyler's administration negotiated a formal annexation treaty, the Senate rejected it in 1844 after heated debates over slavery, expansion, and war risk that you can still read in the Congressional Globe. Under Article 2 of the Constitution, treaties require a two-thirds Senate vote, and Tyler didn't have the numbers, but he and his advisors, with help from pro-annexation Democrats in Congress, turned to a different device, a joint resolution, which only needed simple majorities in both houses. In early 1845, during his final weeks in office, Congress passed such a resolution offering Texas statehood under specific conditions, including the possibility of carving multiple future slave states out of its territory, and Tyler promptly signed it. The text appears in the statutes at large, and correspondence in the Tyler papers at the Library of Congress shows how closely the White House coordinated with Southern expansionists to make it happen. Supporters argued that nothing in the Constitution explicitly barred using a domestic statute to invite a foreign polity to join the Union, pointing to earlier informal territorial arrangements, while opponents warned in speeches and pamphlets that this maneuver sidestepped the treaty clause's higher threshold and set a precedent for major foreign policy changes being pushed through by bare partisan majorities. Texas accepted the offer and joined as a state later that year under Tyler's successor James K. Polk, but the choice of method mattered. Archival debates and later legal scholarship note that annexation by joint resolution helped lock the United States onto a collision course with Mexico and hardened sectional tensions over slavery, all because a relatively unpopular president and his allies found a procedurally easier, constitutionally contested way around a failed treaty. 12. James K. Polk is usually introduced as the expansion president who fulfilled manifest destiny, adding huge swaths of territory to the United States, but the way his administration opened the Mexican-American War shows how flexible the line between defense and provocation could become when a president framed the facts. In 1845, when the United States annexed Texas, Mexico still considered Texas a rebellious province and insisted the boundary lay at the Nueces River, while Texas and the U.S. claimed the Rio Grande, leaving a large strip of land between the two rivers effectively disputed. Maps, diplomatic notes, and congressional reports from the time all acknowledged that there was no mutually recognized border there. Polk nonetheless ordered General Zachary Taylor to march U.S. troops into that contested zone down to the Rio Grande, a move Mexican officials regarded as an invasion, and in April 1846 Mexican cavalry clashed with a U.S. patrol, killing and capturing several soldiers in what became known as the Thornton Affair. Polk then sent a war message to Congress declaring that American blood has been shed on American soil, language preserved in the House Journal and widely reprinted in contemporary newspapers, even though whether that ground was legally American was precisely the point under dispute. Some members of Congress accepted Polk's framing and voted for war, but others, including a freshman representative named Abraham Lincoln, later pressed the administration with spot resolutions, demanding the exact location, the spot where the first blood was shed, and questioning whether the president had effectively engineered a situation likely to trigger conflict. Mexican sources, U.S. opposition speeches, and later Senate investigations all point to the same uncomfortable ambiguity. The United States entered a war that would strip Mexico of roughly half its territory based on a presidential claim that treated a contested strip of land as unquestionably American, collapsing a nuanced, dangerous border disagreement into a simple story of foreign aggression against the homeland that school narratives often repeat without mentioning how fiercely that story was contested in its own time. 13. Zachary Taylor is often remembered as a rough frontier general who died suddenly in office, but buried under that short presidency is a tangle of contradictions that made both North and South distrust him at the precise moment the country was arguing over whether slavery would spread into the vast lands taken from Mexico. Taylor himself was a substantial Louisiana slaveholder, with plantations documented in census schedules and estate records holding over 100 enslaved people, and he profited directly from that system for decades before entering the White House. Yet when the question arose of organizing the Mexican Cession, he privately and then publicly signaled that he did not want slavery extended into those new territories. Instead of pushing for the compromise formulas Southern politicians expected, like extending the Missouri Compromise line westward, Taylor favored admitting California and New Mexico directly as free states under the doctrine that the people there would decide, a position you can see in his December 1849 annual message and in letters preserved in the Taylor Papers, where he told Southern allies not to agitate slavery as a condition of admission. This stance infuriated many of the same Southern leaders who had helped elect him, including prominent senators who assumed that a slaveholding president from Louisiana would defend their interests in the Senate debates recorded in the Congressional Globe, and some began quietly discussing secession or at least organized resistance if Congress tried to block slavery's expansion. At the same time, Northern anti-slavery politicians didn't trust Taylor either, pointing to his personal ownership of human beings, and to campaign speeches that had carefully avoided committing him to any moral position on slavery, and they worried that his opposition to specific bills might soften once the pressure from Southern Democrats and Whigs intensified. Cabinet records and private correspondence from 1849 and 1850 show an administration trying to hold the line against compromise proposals that would please the South by opening more land to slavery, while also refusing to embrace the Wilmot Proviso's outright ban, creating a kind of vacuum where mistrust grew on both sides. When Taylor died suddenly in July 1850, his successor Millard Fillmore quickly embraced a very different approach, but Taylor's brief, uneasy attempt to block the expansion of slavery while still personally owning enslaved laborers, left behind a record in National Archives files and newspaper editorials of a president whose personal stake in slavery did not stop him from obstructing its political spread, and yet whose refusal to take a clear, consistent stand deepened sectional suspicion in a way textbooks often gloss over. 14. Millard Fillmore tends to show up in survey courses as the quiet man who signed the Compromise of 1850 and then disappears. But one part of that compromise carried consequences far larger than his low profile suggests, because his signature put the federal government's full weight behind capturing alleged runaway slaves, even in places where local communities wanted nothing to do with it. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which Fillmore supported in messages to Congress and then signed into law, created a system where federal commissioners could order people sent south into slavery based on the sworn statement of a claimant, while explicitly denying the accused the right to testify on their own behalf and barring jury trials. You can read those provisions in the statutes at large and in the contemporary enforcement instructions preserved in the National Archives. Commissioners were paid more if they ruled that the person was a fugitive than if they ruled in favor of freedom, a fee structure documented in Treasury records that abolitionists in pamphlets and newspapers condemned as a built-in financial bias toward enslavement. The law also compelled ordinary citizens and local officials in free states to assist in captures when called upon, turning U.S. Marshals and sometimes even bystanders into an informal slave-catching network under federal authority, and threatening fines or jail for anyone who interfered. Court cases like the rescue of Shadrach Minkins in Boston and the Anthony Burns case, which filled northern streets with troops to send one man back to bondage, show how this worked in practice. Fillmore's own correspondence and later memoirs from members of his cabinet indicate he saw rigid enforcement as a constitutional duty, even when mass protests erupted in northern cities and state legislatures responded with personal liberty laws designed to blunt or obstruct the act's reach. Pro-slavery politicians praised Fillmore for upholding what they considered Southern rights, but black communities, abolitionists, and many white Northerners viewed the law as proof that the federal government would sacrifice basic procedural protections and human freedom to keep slaveholding states in the Union. Petitions, sermons, and local resolutions preserved in state archives record that sense of betrayal. By placing his name and presidency behind a law that denied due process to people on American soil based solely on their presumed status as property, Fillmore transformed the abstract constitutional debate over slavery into a direct question of whether the national government would help hunt human beings, and the anger that choice generated helped push more Northerners from passive dislike of slavery to active opposition long before shots were fired at Fort Sumter. 15. Franklin Pierce's administration is usually associated with words like doughface and weak, but on one critical issue he was not passive at all. He used presidential power to enforce a law that tore up a long-standing sectional boundary and turned the prairie into a war zone. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, pushed through Congress by Stephen Douglas but signed enthusiastically by Pierce, repealed the Missouri Compromise's ban on slavery north of the 3630 line and replaced it with so-called popular sovereignty, letting settlers in Kansas and Nebraska vote slavery up or down, a shift spelled out in the Act's text and in Pierce's own special message endorsing it. By treating slavery's expansion as a local choice rather than a line the federal government would hold, the law invited pro-slavery and anti-slavery activists to flood Kansas in order to control the territorial legislature, and both sides did so, backed by money and weapons from organizations whose fundraising letters and minutes still sit in state historical societies. Pro-slavery border ruffians from neighboring Missouri crossed into Kansas during elections, cast illegal ballots, and used intimidation and violence to help install a pro-slavery territorial government at Lecompton, a pattern documented in congressional investigations and eyewitness accounts gathered in the 1856 Howard Committee report. When Free State settlers set up a rival government in Topeka and appealed to Washington, Pierce's administration refused to recognize them, instead backing the pro-slavery legislature as the only legitimate authority and authorizing the use of federal troops to disperse the Free State Assembly, a decision reflected in War Department orders and Pierce's own proclamations. The result was Bleeding Kansas, a period of raids, reprisals, and massacres, like the sack of Lawrence and John Brown's retaliatory killings at Pottawatomie Creek, where armed bands claimed to be enforcing or resisting the same federal law, and ordinary settlers found themselves caught in a miniature civil war years before 1861. Pierce's defenders at the time argued that he was simply upholding statutes passed by Congress and preserving order, while critics in speeches reprinted in the Congressional Globe accused him of using federal muscle to tilt the playing field towards slavery and to crush a community that had tried to resist through legal channels. Historians who mine Pierce's papers and cabinet correspondence note that he leaned heavily on Southern advisors and consistently interpreted ambiguous situations in Kansas in ways that favored pro-slavery authorities, helping turn what might have been a contained dispute over territorial process into a national symbol of broken promises and bloodshed. By choosing to sign and then vigorously enforce a law that scrapped the Missouri Compromise's clear line in favor of a volatile experiment in local decision-making, Pierce helped turn an abstract debate over where slavery could go into a real shooting conflict on the ground. And the images and testimonies from Bleeding Kansas, preserved in archives, did as much as any speech to convince Americans that compromise on slavery's expansion was collapsing long before Lincoln took office. 16. James Buchanan stepped into the Kansas crisis with all the calm certainty of a man who believed the paperwork mattered more than the people, and his choice of which paperwork to trust helped push the country closer to war. By the time he took office in 1857, Bleeding Kansas was already a byword, and Congress had sent out investigators whose 1856 Howard Committee report, now in the National Archives, documented voter fraud and violence by pro-slavery border ruffians who crossed from Missouri to stuff ballot boxes and intimidate Free State settlers. Out of that chaos came the Lecompton Constitution, drafted by a convention boycotted by many genuine Free State residents. Territorial census records and contemporary newspaper accounts show that a large share of Kansas settlers either refused to participate or were effectively locked out of the process. The document itself protected slavery, limited the ability of the legislature to touch it, and was presented to voters in a way that practically guaranteed a pro-slavery outcome. Since the initial referendum allowed people to vote only on Constitution with slavery or Constitution without slavery, while still preserving enslaved people already held there. Buchanan knew about the irregularities. His own Attorney General, Jeremiah Black, and reports sent to the White House, preserved in the Buchanan Papers, outlined the boycotts and charges of fraud, but in his December 1857 message to Congress, he declared Lecompton the legitimate expression of Kansas popular sovereignty and urged Congress to admit Kansas as a state under it. He leaned on Democratic members of Congress, offering patronage and favor, letters and party archives show, to secure votes for a constitution that large numbers of Kansans had never accepted, while dismissing the rival Free State Topeka government as revolutionary, even though it sprang from mass meetings and elections documented in territorial records. This stance split his own party. Stephen Douglas, architect of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, broke publicly with Buchanan in speeches recorded in the Congressional Globe, arguing that forcing Lecompton on Kansas betrayed the principle of genuine local choice, and Northern Democrats watched their constituents recoil from what looked like a presidential attempt to impose slavery through sham process. When Kansans were finally allowed a clearer up or down vote in 1858, they rejected the Lecompton Constitution by a wide margin, confirming what local petitions and memorials had been saying all along. Yet the episode left behind the impression, anchored in correspondence, congressional debates, and editorial pages, that Buchanan had been willing to ignore clear evidence about actual settlers' wishes in order to placate pro-slavery interests. Textbooks often summarize this as a controversy over Kansas statehood, but the paper trail shows something more specific and more unsettling: a sitting president throwing his weight behind a constitution widely viewed on the ground as illegitimate, effectively trying to drag a territory into the Union as a slave state over the protest of many who lived there, and in the process deepening the sectional mistrust that would explode only a few years later. 17. Abraham Lincoln is often remembered as the president who signed the Emancipation Proclamation and spoke of malice toward none, but during his administration, he also approved the largest mass execution in United States history, and it did not involve Confederate soldiers. In 1862, as the Civil War raged in the East, tensions on the Minnesota frontier erupted into the U.S. Dakota War. After years of broken treaty promises, delayed annuity payments, and encroaching white settlement, conditions described in detail in Indian office reports and congressional testimony, where even some federal agents conceded that Dakota people were starving. After several weeks of violent clashes, the U.S. Army captured hundreds of Dakota men. Military commissions swiftly tried 393 of them, usually in proceedings that lasted minutes, often without legal counsel and translated imperfectly, as later reviews of the trial records in the National Archives have documented. Of those, 303 were sentenced to death, and under federal law, those sentences required presidential review. Lincoln called for the full trial transcripts and, with advisors, went through case by case, a process described in War Department correspondence and in letters preserved at the Library of Congress. He commuted most of the sentences, focusing on what he defined as convictions for rape or the killing of civilians, and ultimately approved 39 executions, later reduced to 38 when one man's identity was found to be mistaken. On December 26, 1862, in Mankato, Minnesota, those 38 Dakota men were hanged in a public mass execution, while thousands watched, a spectacle reported in local newspapers and confirmed in official Army dispatches, under direct presidential authority that Lincoln never disavowed in his surviving correspondence. Defenders of Lincoln have long argued, and some historians agree, that by the standards of the time his commutation saved more than 250 men from the gallows in the face of intense local and congressional pressure for harsher reprisals. Pressure you can see in petitions from Minnesota politicians demanding broader executions. Dakota descendants, Native scholars, and other historians counter that the trials themselves were structurally unjust, that the guilt of many men was tenuous at best, and that Lincoln's willingness to accept the framework of those commissions while declining to interrogate the treaty violations and hunger that fueled the uprising reveals a sharp moral line between his concern for enslaved African Americans and his approach to indigenous nations. Modern presidents have issued apologies and commemorations, most notably formal acknowledgments by Minnesota officials and statements from the White House on anniversaries of the hanging, but no federal court has revisited the convictions, and the execution orders bearing Lincoln's signature remain in the archival record. The same administration that is rightly credited with ending legal slavery also oversaw and legitimized a mass hanging born from a system of broken treaties and military justice, an uncomfortable overlap that rarely makes it into the familiar stories of Lincoln as purely the great emancipator. 18. Andrew Johnson entered high office under a cloud of alcohol and humiliation that his political enemies never forgot, and that early impression colored how people interpreted everything he did once Lincoln was gone. On March 4, 1865, Johnson took the oath as vice president in the Senate chamber because Lincoln's second inauguration used that space for the swearing-in, and multiple eyewitnesses from New York Times reporters to senators, whose letters now sit in the Library of Congress, described him as visibly unsteady, his face flushed, his speech rambling and disjointed. Johnson later claimed, in statements recorded in his papers and in sympathetic biographies, that he had been ill with typhoid fever and had taken medicinal whiskey on an empty stomach, but contemporaries in the chamber wrote of him slurring words, repeating himself, and launching into partisan attacks that seemed wildly out of place in a ceremonial setting meant to project national unity. Vice presidents traditionally say little at such events, but Johnson launched into a long, unscripted address, boasting about his humble origins, calling out cabinet members by name, and at one point asking the crowd for a glass of water, then more whiskey, details that recur across diary entries from both allies and opponents, suggesting that, at minimum, he had badly misjudged the moment. Newspapers the next day debated how drunk he had been, with some Democratic-leaning presses downplaying the incident and others, including Republican organs, using it to label him a disgrace. The range of accounts makes clear that while the exact degree of intoxication is impossible to measure now, the perception of scandal was widespread enough to reach Lincoln himself. Lincoln is reported, in recollections collected later and discussed cautiously by historians because of the time gap, to have expressed embarrassment, but kept Johnson on the ticket because the war was nearly won, and changing vice presidents again made little sense. 6 weeks later, when Lincoln was assassinated, that same man from the chaotic swearing-in became president overnight, suddenly responsible for shaping Reconstruction policy and dealing with the very congressional leaders who had watched his inaugural performance. Johnson's defenders at the time argued that a single bad day should not define a career, and medical historians have pointed out that severe illness combined with 19th century tonics could easily produce impaired behavior, but the incident gave his critics in Congress an early, vivid image of him as unstable and unfit. When Johnson later vetoed civil rights bills, opposed the 14th Amendment, and fought with radical Republicans over the direction of Reconstruction, many of those same critics reached back to that March 4 speech as symbolic proof that the man now standing in the way of black citizenship and federal protection had been an embarrassment from the moment he entered the national stage, a linkage that modern textbooks usually compress into a sentence or two, if they mention it at all. 19. Ulysses S. Grant is often praised for fighting the Ku Klux Klan and backing the 15th Amendment, but his administration also presided over one of the most notorious land seizures in U.S. history, the taking of the Black Hills from the Lakota in direct violation of a treaty the federal government had signed. Under the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty, whose text you can read in the National Archives, the United States recognized the Black Hills as part of the absolute and undisturbed use and occupation of the Great Sioux Reservation, and it required the consent of 3/4 of adult male Lakota to cede any part of that land. For a few years, that promise held on paper, but in 1874, Grant authorized an expedition led by George Armstrong Custer into the Black Hills, officially to scout for a new fort, but the Army's own reports and Custer's dispatches, later reprinted in newspapers, showed they were also prospecting for gold. When soldiers and civilian experts confirmed gold deposits, white miners poured in despite the treaty, and Indian Bureau correspondence from the period is full of Lakota complaints about trespassers and of local officials shrugging that they couldn't hold the rush back. Instead of enforcing the treaty and removing the miners, Grant's administration quietly changed policy. Internal War Department and Interior Department memos, brought to light in later court cases and Senate investigations, describe a no-interference stance that effectively greenlit the invasion. In 1875, a presidential commission tried to pressure Lakota leaders into selling the Black Hills, offering what even some federal negotiators admitted in letters was a lowball price. Lakota representatives like Red Cloud and Spotted Tail refused, and there is no record of anything close to 3/4 male consent. Yet in 1877, after the Great Sioux War and battles like Little Bighorn, Congress passed an act seizing the Black Hills anyway, something the Supreme Court in United States v. Sioux Nation of Indians in 1980 later called a taking that did not meet constitutional standards of just compensation. The court awarded financial damages based on the 1877 value plus interest, but the Lakota have famously refused to accept the money, insisting that the land itself was never legitimately sold and that accepting a payout would legitimate a theft that began under Grant. Schoolbook portraits of Grant as the general who saved the Union and the president who battled white supremacist terror rarely dwell on that other part of his record, a commander-in-chief who, when gold and pressure from settlers collided with treaty obligations, allowed a supposedly binding promise to native nations to be swept aside. 20. Rutherford B. Hayes is usually a bland name in the long list of presidents, remembered mainly for a disputed election, but the quiet deal that put him in the White House also marked a turning point that left millions of Black Americans effectively on their own. The election of 1876 between Hayes and Samuel J. Tilden was so close and so riddled with contested returns that Congress created an electoral commission to sort it out, a process documented in the congressional record and in affidavits from southern states where both parties claimed victory. Behind the formal dispute, party leaders met in private, and although historians still debate the exact details of what was promised, contemporary letters, memos, and newspaper accounts converge on what became known as the Compromise of 1877. Democrats would accept Hayes as president if Republicans agreed to withdraw the last federal troops from South Carolina and Louisiana and signal an end to aggressive Reconstruction enforcement. Hayes himself, in his diary and in correspondence preserved at the Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Library, wrote about restoring home rule in the South and made it clear he believed Southern whites, not federal soldiers, should be primarily responsible for maintaining order. When he took office, his administration moved quickly. By April 1877, federal troops were pulled out of state houses where they had been backing Republican Reconstruction governments, and within months those governments collapsed, replaced by Redeemer regimes dominated by white Democrats determined to roll back Black political gains. The Ku Klux Klan and similar groups had already been terrorizing Black voters for years, as Justice Department records and Freedmen's Bureau reports show, but without the visible backing of federal troops and aggressive prosecutions, that violence became even more effective at suppressing the vote. Over the next 2 decades, Southern state legislatures built an elaborate system of poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and racial gerrymandering, documented in state law books, and challenged in cases like Williams v. Mississippi that combined with lynching and economic coercion to strip most Black citizens of the rights the Reconstruction Amendments were supposed to protect. Textbooks often summarize this moment as the end of Reconstruction, with a neat date and a phrase about sectional reconciliation, but the archival trail reveals something starker. The resolution of Hayes's contested presidency was tied directly to a political decision to step back from protecting black civil and voting rights, handing the field to state governments that then engineered almost a century of Jim Crow. 21. James A. Garfield's presidency lasted just a few months before he was shot, and for generations the story stopped there. A tragic assassination by a deranged office seeker, but modern medical historians, looking at the surviving records, have argued that the bullet may not have been his only killer. On July 2, 1881, Charles Guiteau shot Garfield in a Washington train station. Contemporary accounts, including the president's own physician's notes and newspaper coverage archived at the Library of Congress, make clear that the initial wound was serious but not immediately fatal. Garfield remained conscious and was moved back to the White House. From that moment until his death in September, his doctors repeatedly probed the wound with unwashed fingers and unsterilized instruments, something that sounded normal to many American physicians at the time, but had already been challenged by germ theory advocates, like Joseph Lister in Europe. In later memoirs and interviews, Garfield's chief physician, Dr. D. Willard Bliss, openly dismissed Lister's methods as fads. Bliss and his colleagues made incision after incision, trying to find and remove the bullet, guided in part by an early metal detector that Alexander Graham Bell built for the case, which failed in part because Bliss insisted on using it only on one side of the body, a decision Bell later regretted in his own writings. Autopsy reports published after Garfield's death show extensive infection, abscesses, and a misplaced tunnel of damage that did not match the bullet's actual path, suggesting that much of the internal trauma came from medical interventions, not just the shot itself. By the late 20th century, surgeons and medical historians reading those reports, as detailed in articles in the Journal of the American Medical Association and in studies cited by the National Library of Medicine, argued that if Garfield had received even basic antiseptic care, or if doctors had simply left the bullet in place as they often do today, he likely would have survived. Not all historians agree on the degree of certainty, and some caution against retroactively armchair quarterbacking 19th century medicine with modern standards, pointing out that germ theory was still controversial in the United States. But even those more cautious assessments acknowledge the documentary record, doctors putting ungloved hands into a president's wound over and over despite rising fever and obvious infection, in an era when growing scientific evidence about microbes was available and being ignored. The story that shows up in school books, a president felled by an assassin's bullet, leaves out the unsettling suggestion written into the medical charts and the autopsy tables, that the people trying to save Garfield, working under outdated assumptions and professional pride, almost certainly made his suffering longer and his death more likely. 22. Chester A. Arthur is usually remembered, if at all, as the unexpectedly competent gentleman president who signed civil service reform, but his signature also sits on one of the earliest and clearest federal declarations that certain people simply should not be allowed to come to the United States at all. In 1882, after a generation of heated debate in Congress and on the West Coast about Chinese immigration, lawmakers sent Arthur the Chinese Exclusion Act, and you can read the enrolled act today in the National Archives. It suspended the immigration of Chinese laborers for 10 years, barred Chinese immigrants already in the country from naturalizing, and required any Chinese person who left the United States to obtain re-entry certificates as if they were a suspect class. Earlier that year, Arthur had actually vetoed a harsher version that imposed a 20-year ban, a fact his defenders sometimes point to, but his veto message preserved in his presidential papers makes it clear his concern was about treaty obligations with China, not about the principle of exclusion itself. Once Congress scaled the term back to 10 years and adjusted language to fit the existing Burlingame and Angel treaties, he signed it. The law built on earlier measures like the 1875 Page Act, which had targeted Chinese and other Asian women under the guise of stopping lewd and immoral immigrants, but the 1882 Act was the first major statute to create a sweeping federal immigration ban based explicitly on nationality and, in practice, race. Treasury Department enforcement records and federal court cases from the 1880s show Chinese workers being detained, questioned, and deported under rules that did not apply to Europeans, while immigration inspectors and judges wrestled with defining who qualified as a laborer and who could be admitted as a merchant or student. The Supreme Court upheld this approach in decisions like Che Chan-ping v. United States in 1889, sometimes called the Chinese exclusion case, where the justices endorsed a broad plenary power doctrine giving Congress near total control over immigration policy, even when it openly discriminated. Textbooks tend to mention Chinese exclusion as a quick example of nativism or a prelude to later quota laws, but the documents from Arthur's era show something starker, a bipartisan agreement, signed by a president often described as moderate, that the federal government could and should write entire nationalities out of the story of who was allowed to belong. 23. Grover Cleveland liked to project an image of blunt honesty. The slogan, "A public office is a public trust," was practically stapled to his name. But in the summer of 1893, as the country slid into a financial crisis, he quietly boarded a yacht and disappeared from public view for one of the most secretive presidential medical procedures on record. That year, Wall Street had panicked, railroads were failing, and newspapers tracked the plunging markets in what we now call the Panic of 1893. So when reporters noticed that Cleveland had vanished from Washington for what aides described only as a fishing trip on friend Elias Benedict's yacht, the Boneta rumor mills went into overdrive. The official story, which you can see repeated in contemporary press clippings preserved in the Library of Congress, was that the president was simply taking a short vacation. In reality, as later memoirs by participants and medical articles in journals like Annals of Surgery revealed, Cleveland had developed a cancerous lesion, likely a carcinoma, on the roof of his mouth that his doctors feared could spread or disfigure him. Because markets were already fragile, Cleveland and his inner circle decided that any hint of serious illness might worsen the panic or trigger a constitutional crisis, so they arranged for the surgery to happen aboard the Oneida as it cruised up Long Island Sound, turning the yacht into a makeshift operating room where surgeons removed much of his upper left jaw and palate under ether. Dental and surgical notes, later deposited in collections at the College of Physicians of Philadelphia, describe instruments clanking as the boat rocked and the team working to preserve his facial appearance so that with a prosthetic obturator plate, he could return to public life without obvious signs of what had happened. For years, the administration denied newspaper stories that hinted at anything more serious than dental work, and when one reporter, E.J. Edwards, published an account suggesting a hidden major operation, Cleveland allies publicly attacked his credibility. Only decades later, after the president and his physicians were dead, did surviving participants like Dr. William Keene confirm the essentials in print. Today, historians generally accept that this secrecy was real and quite deliberate, and while some scholars debate whether it was justified by the fragile economy, the documentary trail is clear. During one of the worst financial crises of the 19th century, a sitting president had a large portion of his jaw removed in secret on a private yacht, and the public was told almost nothing. 24. The darker side of Grover Cleveland's image doesn't end with hidden surgeries. Long before he reached the White House, he became entangled in a case that modern readers and many historians find deeply unsettling, involving a woman named Maria Halpin and a child she said was his. In the 1884 presidential campaign, as newspapers you can still scroll through on Chronicling America show, Republican operatives helped circulate a story that Cleveland, then the Democratic nominee and a bachelor, had fathered an illegitimate child with Halpin, a Buffalo store clerk, and had then arranged for her to be placed in an asylum and the child sent to an orphanage. Cleveland's allies responded with a now famous advice line, "Tell the truth," and he admitted having had relations with Halpin around the relevant time and paying child support, while suggesting that other men in his circle might also have been possible fathers, a claim some biographers have noted but for which there is limited documentary corroboration beyond his own statements and those of political friends. Police records and affidavits from the period, unearthed by later researchers and cited in works published by university presses, confirmed that Halpin was indeed taken to a mental institution and that her infant son was sent to a Catholic orphanage, and that Cleveland had a direct role in the arrangements, though accounts differ on how voluntary her commitment was. Some contemporary documents describe her as hysterical or unstable, while later historians, reading between the lines of gendered 19th century language, have questioned whether those descriptions were weaponized to control an inconvenient woman. As for the initial encounter, Halpin told friends and, later, an interviewer for a New York newspaper that Cleveland had coerced her and used his position as a rising local lawyer and politician, allegations that cannot be definitively proved or disproved now, but that are consistent with the power imbalances of the era. Cleveland's supporters at the time framed the story as a youthful moral failing he had taken responsibility for by supporting the child financially, while his opponents painted it as a pattern of abuse and institutionalization. Modern scholars who have reviewed the surviving legal documents, press accounts, and correspondence generally agree that something far more serious than a consensual affair, followed by gentlemanly support, took place, even if the precise nature of that first night remains contested. School book summaries often reduce Cleveland's 1884 scandal to a jokey chant. "Ma, ma, where's my pa?" Answering with "Gone to the White House, ha ha ha." But the archival record behind that rhyme points to a woman whose life was upended, a child removed, and a future president using legal and medical systems in ways that, by contemporary standards, look uncomfortably like coercion. 25. Benjamin Harrison's name rarely appears in the same sentence as Wounded Knee in schoolbooks, but the massacre that ended what the National Archives and Army reports still call the Indian Wars was the bloody consequence of choices made in his administration, not just a tragic accident on a snowy day in 1890. When Harrison took office in 1889, he embraced a hardline assimilation policy built into the Dawes Act that his predecessor had signed, but he now aggressively implemented, breaking up tribal landholdings into individual allotments and opening surplus land to white settlers. Interior Department records show he issued multiple proclamations opening millions of acres in the Dakotas and elsewhere, putting enormous pressure on the Lakota people forced onto shrinking, underfunded reservations. At the same time, the ghost dance movement spread across the plains, a religious revival rooted in despair and hope that, as anthropologists and agency reports from the era describe, promised the return of the buffalo and the fading of white domination if believers danced and lived righteously. Reservation agents and military officers, reading panic telegrams, now preserved in Harrison's presidential papers, told Washington that the ghost dance was a dangerous uprising, even though many observers, including some missionaries, noted it was largely peaceful and spiritual. Harrison's response, documented in War Department orders, was to reinforce garrisons, rush troops into the area, and authorize the arrest of key Lakota leaders like Sitting Bull, creating a climate of military escalation rather than negotiation. After Sitting Bull was killed during a botched arrest by Indian police aligned with the U.S. authorities, hundreds of Lakota, including many women and children, fled toward Pine Ridge under Chief Bigfoot, who was sick with pneumonia and seeking refuge. Instead, they were intercepted by the 7th Cavalry at Wounded Knee Creek and disarmed under orders ultimately rooted in Harrison's directives to suppress the ghost dance. The chaotic gunfire that followed, which Army inquiries and later congressional testimony detail in grim numbers, over 250 Lakota dead, many shot while fleeing, was later officially labeled a battle and showered with medals of honor. Only generations later did historians and some lawmakers call it what survivors had always known it to be, a massacre. Textbooks often treat Wounded Knee as a sad but isolated endpoint of frontier conflict. Yet the paper trail from the Harrison administration shows a more uncomfortable truth. Federal policy choices about land, religion, and military force helped tighten the vice that made such a catastrophe almost inevitable. 26. William McKinley is often portrayed as the reassuring, kindly president who liked to pray over big decisions, but declassified correspondence and congressional debates from his era show that his decision to annex the Philippines after the Spanish-American War plunged the islands into a brutal conflict that looked nothing like the liberation language Americans were sold. In 1898, when McKinley asked Congress for authority to intervene against Spain and Cuba, his public messages framed it as a humanitarian mission to end atrocities and secure Cuban independence, and the Teller Amendment explicitly disclaimed any U.S. intention to annex Cuba. Filipino revolutionaries under Emilio Aguinaldo, who had been fighting Spanish rule, understandably assumed similar principles would apply to them. Instead, as documents in the McKinley presidential papers and reports from the Paris peace negotiations show, U.S. negotiators insisted Spain cede the Philippines to the United States for $20 million, and McKinley told Methodist ministers in a speech reprinted in period newspapers that he had stayed up praying and decided Providence required the U.S. to educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them, even though the majority of Filipinos were already Catholic. When Filipino leaders objected to exchanging one colonial ruler for another, tensions escalated around Manila. U.S. and Filipino troops eyed each other across lines outside the city until a nighttime clash near a blockhouse in February 1899, whose exact details are still debated by historians, triggered open war. The conflict that followed, which official U.S. Army histories once blandly called an insurrection, involved tactics that internal reports and later Senate hearings exposed. Reconcentration zones, widespread use of the water cure, torture to force information, and devastating reprisals against villages suspected of aiding guerrillas. Estimates compiled by scholars using census data and military records suggest that hundreds of thousands of Filipinos died, many from disease and famine tied to the war's disruptions, while American casualty lists preserved in War Department files count thousands of dead and wounded on the U.S. side. Public debate back home, captured in the congressional record and newspapers like the New York World and the Anti-Imperialist League's pamphlets, shows that many Americans at the time recognized the contradiction between McKinley's rhetoric of liberation and the reality of a drawn-out colonial war, but school narratives often reduce it to a short footnote after the sinking of the Maine. Looking back through the archives, McKinley's choice to keep the Philippines was not a benign misunderstanding. It was a conscious policy of annexation that set off a war whose human cost in the islands far exceeded the quick, splendid little war that preceded it. 27. Theodore Roosevelt's image in popular history is full of national parks, Rough Rider charges, and progressive reforms, but buried in Army files and congressional records is the Brownsville Affair, where his administration summarily punished more than 160 black soldiers for a shooting they consistently denied committing. In August 1906, in the segregated border town of Brownsville, Texas, shots were fired one night that left one white bartender dead and a police officer wounded. Local white residents quickly blamed black members of the 25th Infantry Regiment stationed nearby, while the soldiers and their white officers insisted they had been confined to barracks under orders. The Army's investigation, whose documents you can read in the National Archives, turned up conflicting testimony, missing shell casings, and what some later analysts called planted evidence, but no court-martial identified individual guilty parties. Instead, under pressure from outraged Texas politicians and amid a national climate steeped in Jim Crow racism, Roosevelt decided to treat the regiment itself as collectively guilty of a conspiracy of silence. In November 1906, citing his powers as commander-in-chief and using language preserved in his formal order, he ordered 167 black enlisted men dishonorably discharged without trial, stripping them of pensions and veterans' benefits, and barred them from federal employment, a punishment that affected not only them, but their families' economic futures. Contemporary black newspapers, as well as leaders like Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, protested loudly with editorials and NAACP records from the period condemning the move as a grave injustice and a political concession to Southern white opinion. Roosevelt dug in, defending his decision in messages to Congress and in his autobiography, arguing that discipline required harsh action even though no court had found any man guilty. For decades, the discharged soldiers lived under a cloud, some dying before their names were ever reconsidered, until new reviews in the 1970s under President Nixon and then Carter, based on re-examined evidence and testimony, concluded that many, perhaps all, of the men had been wrongly accused. The Army eventually changed their discharges to honorable and offered symbolic back pay, gestures recorded in Defense Department files that came far too late to undo the original harm. School lessons tend to celebrate Roosevelt's trust-busting and conservation, but the Brownsville Affair sits in the archival record as a reminder that even reform-minded presidents could, when confronted with racially charged accusations, choose expedient injustice over the due process they were sworn to uphold. 28. William Howard Taft doesn't usually make it into the darker chapters of U.S. foreign policy, but his dollar diplomacy in Central America turned Nicaragua into a case study in how financial pressure and military force could be blended to reshape another country's politics around American priorities. When Taft took office in 1909, State Department memos and his own messages to Congress show that he favored replacing old-style gunboat seizures with strategic use of U.S. bankers and loans, especially in places where European powers might intervene over debt. Nicaragua, already unstable under President José Santos Zelaya, quickly became a focus. Zelaya's nationalist policies, including flirting with rival canal routes and taxing U.S. companies, made him a problem in Washington's eyes, and diplomatic cables preserved in the National Archives show American officials eagerly documenting rebellions against him while giving quiet support to his conservative opponents. After a rebellion broke out in 1909, the Taft administration publicly denounced Zelaya over the execution of 2 U.S. mercenaries who had joined the rebels, calling them canal surveyors in protests that historians and contemporary press accounts note stretched the truth and used the incident as leverage to force his resignation under threat of broader U.S. intervention. With Zelaya gone, Taft's team helped midwife a new conservative regime under Adolfo Diaz, a former employee of an American mining company, then pushed a sweeping loan through Wall Street banks to refinance Nicaragua's debts. The terms, laid out in contracts now stored in U.S. and Nicaraguan archives, effectively gave American bankers control over the country's customs houses and railways. When Nicaraguan legislators and rebels balked at this arrangement, seeing it as a financial takeover, unrest escalated again. In 1912, Taft ordered Marines back into the country, ostensibly to protect lives and property, but in practice to prop up Diaz and secure customs revenues for U.S. creditors. Those Marines would remain in Nicaragua in one form or another for years, laying the groundwork for the Somoza dynasty that dominated Nicaraguan politics for much of the 20th century. In school surveys, Taft is mostly the president who got stuck in a bathtub and later became Chief Justice, but the paperwork on dollar diplomacy reveals him as a key architect of a model where American loans, backed by American rifles, could realign an entire nation's political and economic system in Washington's favor. 29. Woodrow Wilson is often praised in textbooks for idealistic phrases about making the world safe for democracy, but inside his own government he oversaw a retreat from racial progress by resegregating parts of the federal workforce that had been at least partially integrated since Reconstruction. Before Wilson took office in 1913, black and white civil servants worked together in several federal departments, especially Treasury and the Post Office, and photographs and personnel records from the late 19th century show integrated offices in Washington. The system was far from equal, but it was more open than most of Jim Crow America. Wilson's election, supported in part by Southern Democrats, brought in cabinet secretaries who openly advocated segregation, and correspondence preserved in the Library of Congress and the National Archives shows early meetings where those appointees pushed for efficiency, measures that just happened to include separating workers by race. Within months, agencies began installing physical screens in offices, reassigning black employees to segregated sections or demoting them, and in some cases introducing separate restrooms and dining facilities. Internal memos from the Treasury and Post Office, later cited by the NAACP and historians, make clear that these changes were justified in bureaucratic language, but rooted in racial ideology. Black civil servants wrote protest letters, some of which survive in NAACP files and Wilson's own papers, describing lost promotions and humiliating new rules, while leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois and William Monroe Trotter confronted the administration directly. Trotter's 1914 White House meeting, recorded in press accounts and fragments of notes, ended with Wilson bristling at criticism and effectively shutting down further dialogue. When challenged, Wilson defended the policies as protective and orderly, telling critics that segregation reduced friction, a phrase reported in the press and in Trotter's accounts, while his Postmaster General, Albert Burleson, argued in congressional hearings that Southern customs had to be respected in the federal workplace. The resegregation did not come from any single public law laying it out. Instead, it spread through departmental orders and personnel decisions, which made it easier for later generations to ignore or downplay how systematic the shift was. By the time Wilson left office, many black professionals had been driven out of federal careers or stalled in lower-level jobs, a quiet but far-reaching reversal whose paper trail runs through civil service rosters, complaint letters, and NAACP reports, rather than the lofty speeches that usually represent his presidency in classrooms. 30. The story of Woodrow Wilson and the film The Birth of a Nation is often boiled down to a disputed quote, but the documented part that rarely gets much attention in school is that his White House hosted a 1915 screening of a movie, whose racist mythology helped fuel a national wave of Ku Klux Klan revival. The Birth of a Nation, directed by D.W. Griffith and based on Thomas Dixon Jr.'s novels, portrayed Reconstruction as a nightmare of black misrule and heroic Klan rescue, and it leaned heavily on pseudo-historical arguments that drew in part on Wilson's own earlier scholarly writing. His 1902 book History of the American People, preserved in his papers and widely cited at the time, included passages that described Reconstruction governments in harshly racist terms. When the film was released, Dixon, who had been Wilson's acquaintance from their days in the South, pushed hard for official recognition, White House logs and contemporary newspaper reports confirmed that in February 1915, a special showing was arranged in the East Room for Wilson, his family, and guests, making it the first known full-length feature film screened there. What Wilson actually said afterward is contested. Some later accounts claimed he called it like writing history with lightning, while other scholars, including those working with the Wilson papers, note that this exact phrase does not appear in any surviving official record, but the fact of the screening itself was widely publicized by the film's promoters. Ads and posters bragged about presidential approval, and Dixon used the connection in letters and interviews to lend the movie a veneer of historical and governmental legitimacy, just as protests from black organizations were intensifying. The NAACP, in press releases and pamphlets preserved in its archives, documented riots and lynchings that followed showings in several cities, arguing that the film's images and storyline emboldened white supremacist violence. Recruitment materials for the Second Ku Klux Klan, which surged in membership later in the 1910s and 1920s, borrowed heavily from its imagery. Wilson never publicly disavowed the screening or issued a clear statement condemning the film's content, leaving a silence that, combined with his administration's federal resegregation policies, signaled at minimum a willingness to let a deeply distorted and inflammatory narrative of American history circulate unchallenged from the highest office in the land. 31. Wilson's public image in classrooms is often the earnest professor president exhausted by war, but the story of his collapse in 1919 and the way power was handled afterward is one of the strangest constitutional gray zones in presidential history. In October 1919, in the middle of a nationwide tour to rally support for the League of Nations, Wilson suffered what doctors at the time described vaguely as a nervous exhaustion, but White House medical notes and later clinical assessments point to a massive stroke that left him partially paralyzed and cognitively impaired. Instead of informing Congress or the public that the president was severely incapacitated, his physician, Dr. Cary Grayson, and a very small inner circle closed ranks. Records from the Wilson papers and memoirs from staff show that access to Wilson was suddenly controlled almost entirely by the First Lady, Edith Wilson. For the remaining 17 months of his term, outgoing and incoming mail, memos, and proposed legislation passed through Edith's hands first. She later described her role in her memoir as a stewardship, insisting that she merely screened matters and presented only what she thought Wilson could handle. But cabinet diaries and correspondence suggest she sometimes made substantive decisions about what would and would not be acted upon. Members of Congress who asked to see the president were often told he was resting. A few who did get in described, in letters and press interviews, a man who appeared frail, slumped, and barely able to speak, even as official statements continued to portray him as actively engaged. The Constitution's 25th Amendment, which now lays out procedures for declaring a president unable to discharge his duties, did not exist at the time, so there was no formal mechanism to force clarity, and Vice President Thomas Marshall was kept deliberately in the dark, wary of appearing to stage a coup. Historians who have combed through the surviving paperwork, including cabinet meeting notes and the routing of key documents on tariffs and foreign policy, still debate how much independent authority Edith exercised, but they generally agree that from late 1919 to March 1921, the country was effectively governed through a hidden filter controlled by a small, unelected circle around an ailing president. What tends to get lost in school versions of Wilson's presidency is that, during a crucial period for post-war peace and domestic unrest, Americans were never honestly told who was actually making decisions in the Oval Office or how compromised the elected decision-maker really was. 32. When Warren G. Harding's name appears in textbooks, it's usually attached to Teapot Dome and vague talk of a scandal-ridden administration, but one of the most revealing records of his presidency sat sealed in an Ohio archive for half a century, a set of letters to his mistress, Carrie Fulton Phillips. Harding, an Ohio senator before he became president, carried on a long, intense affair with Phillips, the wife of a friend and local businessman, and their correspondence, more than 100 letters now held by the Library of Congress, shows a man who mixed small-town gossip, frank sexual language, and political anxieties in the same pages. In the run-up to World War I, those letters took on an additional edge that worried later archivists and biographers. Phillips was outspokenly pro-German at a time when the U.S. was edging toward entering the war against Germany, and Harding confided in her about his political dilemmas and travels even as he navigated votes in the Senate. When the letters came to light in the 1960s, Harding's relatives and the Phillips family negotiated with the Library of Congress to place them under a long-term seal, arguing in legal and donation documents that their explicit content and potential political implications would cause needless scandal. An agreement kept them closed until 2014. During those decades, historians had to rely on second-hand accounts and rumors, and biographical treatments of Harding often mentioned Carrie Phillips as a shadowy figure in an alleged or probable affair. When the seal finally expired and the letters were opened, journalists, scholars, and the public could read Harding's own words, not only romantic and graphic passages that confirmed the relationship beyond doubt, but also references to his travels, to worries about party politics, and to attempts to manage Phillips's anger when she felt neglected. Some of the more sensational early fears, that the letters contained detailed national secrets or decisive proof of blackmail, were not borne out by the text, and historians now generally see the political risk as more potential than realized. But the episode's paper trail, from the Justice Department's quiet concern about a pro-German mistress during wartime, to the family's successful effort to keep the documents out of view for decades, underlines how much presidential reputations were shaped not just by what happened, but by what archives and families chose to reveal, and when. 33. The other woman most closely associated with Harding in the historical record, Nan Britton, spent most of her life being treated as a liar for telling a story that later DNA testing would finally vindicate. In 1927, just a few years after Harding's sudden death in office, Britton published a book titled The President's Daughter, claiming that she had been Harding's lover and that he had fathered her child, Elizabeth Ann, in 1919 while he was still a senator, meeting her in New York and even in secluded rooms near his Senate office. At the time, mainstream newspapers and many political figures denounced her as an opportunist. Book reviews, court transcripts from a failed support case, and editorials preserved in contemporary press archives show her being mocked, called demented, and accused of fabricating the relationship for money, especially because she had no letters or acknowledged documents to prove her claim. Harding's widow, Florence, and his extended family publicly rejected the story, and for much of the 20th century most standard biographies treated Britton skeptically or relegated her to a footnote, emphasizing the lack of hard evidence and the existence of other Harding rumors. That changed in the early 2010s, when some of Harding's collateral descendants agreed to participate in genetic testing arranged by historians and reported in outlets like the New York Times, and in technical material shared by the testing company. In 2015, the analysis showed that Elizabeth Ann's descendants carried DNA markers consistent with direct descent from Harding's family line and not from alternative candidates, providing a high-confidence confirmation that Harding was in fact her biological grandfather, which, given the timelines and relationships, strongly supports Britton's original claim of an affair. The test could not resurrect every detail Britton described. Historians still debate the accuracy of some scenes in her book, but it demolished the long-standing assertion that she invented the paternity. The episode is now documented not just in memoirs and contested testimony, but in genealogical charts and lab reports. A president whose family and allies used their social and legal power to discredit a young woman, and a woman who died decades before the science existed, to prove that, on the core fact that mattered most to her, she had been telling the truth all along. 34. Calvin Coolidge's face in textbooks tends to be the quiet, small government minimalist who slept a lot and said very little, but one of the most far-reaching laws he signed is usually presented as a neat success story when the reality on the ground was a lot messier. In 1924, Coolidge signed the Indian Citizenship Act, also called the Snyder Act, which declared all non-citizen Native Americans born within the territorial limits of the United States to be U.S. citizens, something many white reformers hailed as a final step toward inclusion, and that modern civic summaries often present as the moment Native people were finally given the right to vote. What those summaries tend to skip is that the Constitution leaves control over voting qualifications largely to the states, and state legislatures and local officials used that loophole aggressively to keep Native people away from the polls for decades after 1924. In states like Arizona and New Mexico, officials argued in court that Native people living on reservations were under guardianship of the federal government and therefore not really full citizens for voting purposes. State Supreme Court rulings from the late 1920s and 1930s upheld these exclusions, despite the federal citizenship law. Elsewhere, states deployed literacy tests, English-only requirements, poll taxes, and residency rules that were written in neutral language but applied and interpreted in ways that disproportionately blocked Native voters, just as they were used against black citizens in the Jim Crow South. Archival records from the Bureau of Indian Affairs and congressional hearings show Native leaders repeatedly testifying that they were technically citizens but still turned away at registration offices, told their homes didn't count for residency, or that reservation addresses couldn't be used. It wasn't until 1948 that Arizona and New Mexico courts finally struck down their explicit bans. And even then, practical barriers like counties refusing to put polling places near reservations or failing to provide translated materials continued well into the late 20th century. So while Coolidge could pose for photographs with Native delegations and point to the Indian Citizenship Act as a milestone, the lived reality documented in state court cases, voting rights lawsuits, and Justice Department reports is that being declared a citizen on paper and being allowed to cast a ballot in practice were, for many Native Americans, separated by an entire generation. 35. Herbert Hoover is usually remembered as the unlucky engineer president swallowed by the Great Depression, the man blamed for bread lines and shanty towns that people derisively called Hoovervilles. But one of the most searing episodes of his presidency involves how his administration treated veterans who had already risked their lives for the country. In 1932, in the depths of the economic collapse, tens of thousands of World War I veterans and their families converged on Washington, D.C., forming what came to be known as the Bonus Army or Bonus Expeditionary Forces. They were there to pressure Congress to pay out, early, a service bonus that had been promised for 1945 but was desperately needed in the present. Congressional records, photographs, and newspaper accounts show them building makeshift camps and shacks along the Anacostia River and in abandoned buildings, holding peaceful marches, and even organizing their own camp rules and sanitation committees as they waited for legislators to act. When the Senate rejected the bonus bill and most of the veterans stayed, hoping for another chance, Hoover and his advisors came to see the encampments as a growing threat to order. Internal memos and later testimony indicate the administration feared communist agitation and portrayed the marchers as potentially radical, even though Army intelligence and the D.C. police chief reported that the vast majority were simply frustrated former soldiers. In late July, Hoover authorized the Army to assist local police in clearing federal property, and the operation quickly escalated, under General Douglas MacArthur, with then-Colonels Dwight Eisenhower and George Patton present. Regular troops advanced with bayonets and cavalry, used tear gas, and set fire to camps as they pushed the veterans and their families out of downtown and across the river. Official reports tried to downplay the violence, but press coverage and veterans' own accounts described men in uniform being driven back by other men in uniform, families choking on gas, and at least 2 veterans killed in earlier clashes with police. Hoover later insisted he had only intended a limited removal, and that MacArthur overstepped his orders by crossing the Anacostia to destroy the larger camp, a claim MacArthur disputed, leaving historians to sift conflicting recollections against the paper trail of written directives and after-action reports. Whatever the command nuances, the images of Army tanks and troops attacking unemployed veterans in the nation's capital burned into public memory and appear in campaign literature, diaries, and editorial cartoons from 1932 as a symbol of a government treating its own former soldiers as an enemy. Textbooks sometimes compress this to a single line about dispersing protesters, but the detailed record shows tear gas, flames, and bayonets used on men who had once worn the same uniform. 36. Franklin D. Roosevelt often appears in lessons as the steady hand who led the country through the Depression and World War II, the author of Fireside Chats and the New Deal. But one of the most troubling decisions of his presidency involves a short executive order that opened the legal door to one of the largest civil liberties violations in modern U.S. history. In February 1942, a little more than 2 months after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, a terse document that did not explicitly mention Japanese Americans or camps, but authorized the War Department to designate military areas and to exclude any or all persons from those zones as commanders saw fit. That seemingly abstract power was quickly translated, through subsequent military proclamations and Public Proclamation No. 1, into a system that targeted people of Japanese ancestry on the West Coast, including U.S. citizens, for forced removal from their homes. War Relocation Authority records and contemporary notices show families given days, or sometimes hours, to sell property, close businesses, and pack what they could carry. The mass incarceration that followed, Over 110,000 people sent to remote camps like Manzanar, Heart Mountain, and Tule Lake was carried out under the authority created by Roosevelt's order, even though intelligence reports available to the administration at the time, including the so-called Munson Report and Navy assessments, had concluded that Japanese American communities posed no widespread threat of sabotage. Internal Justice Department memos and later testimony from officials like Attorney General Francis Biddle indicate there was debate inside the administration, with some lawyers warning that blanket exclusion based on ancestry violated constitutional protections. But political pressure from West Coast politicians, military lobbying, and public fear won out. The Supreme Court, in cases like Korematsu v. United States, upheld the government's actions during the war, deferring heavily to military judgment, although decades later congressional investigations and the 1983 Coram Nobis cases uncovered evidence that key wartime agencies had suppressed or misrepresented intelligence that undercut claims of necessity. In 1988, long after Roosevelt's death, Congress passed the Civil Liberties Act acknowledging that the incarceration had been based on race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership rather than proven military need, and offering a formal apology and limited reparations to surviving detainees. The historical record now makes a careful distinction between the text of Executive Order 9066 itself and the particular way it was implemented, but that distinction doesn't erase the chain that runs from a few lines of legal language signed by a popular president to train manifests, camp rosters, and family photographs of barbed wire that would become part of thousands of Japanese American lives. 37. Franklin D. Roosevelt and the MS St. Louis tends to show up in classes, if at all, as a sad prelude to the Holocaust happening over there. But when you follow the paper trail from ship manifests to State Department cables, it becomes a story about how U.S. immigration policy and presidential inaction helped trap hundreds of people between rising Nazism and a closed door. In May 1939, the German ocean liner MS St. Louis left Hamburg with over 900 mostly Jewish refugees on board, many carrying Cuban landing certificates they had purchased at great cost, hoping to escape persecution in Germany. The ship's passenger list, preserved in archives and reproduced in Holocaust museums, shows families, children, and elderly passengers who had already been stripped of rights under Nazi laws. When the St. Louis reached Havana, the Cuban government, under pressure from domestic politics and corruption scandals, refused to honor most of the landing permits, leaving the ship stuck in harbor while U.S. journalists filed sympathetic stories and American Jewish organizations sent urgent pleas to Washington. Internal memoranda from the State Department, later released and studied by historians, record officials reiterating that existing strict immigration quotas for Germany and Eastern Europe were essentially full, and that no special exception would be made. They also note the political sensitivity of appearing too soft on refugees at a time when nativist and anti-Semitic sentiments were strong in Congress and among voters. The ship sailed close enough to the Florida coast that passengers could see Miami's lights at night, a detail recalled in survivor testimonies and contemporary newspaper reports, but the Roosevelt administration, following State Department recommendations, declined to use executive authority to admit them outside the quota system or to pressure Cuba more forcefully. Roosevelt never issued a public statement about the St. Louis while it was at sea, and historians differ on how much personal involvement he had in the specific decision, but the documented record shows that his administration maintained restrictive policies at a moment when flexibility could have saved hundreds of lives. Eventually, European countries including Britain, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands agreed to take the passengers, but subsequent research by the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and Yad Vashem, cross-referencing transport lists and death records, estimates that over 250 of them were later murdered after German invasions. Textbooks that do mention the MS St. Louis often condense it into a single line about a turned-away refugee ship, but the cables, quota tables, and internal letters reveal a more uncomfortable reality. At a critical moment, the United States, under Roosevelt's watch, chose to keep its immigration laws and political calculations intact rather than bend them for people fleeing a regime we already knew was persecuting its Jewish population. 38. Harry S. Truman is usually introduced as the plain-spoken Missourian who gave 'em hell, ended World War II, and launched the Marshall Plan. But one of his first major domestic acts as president quietly expanded the machinery of suspicion inside the federal government in ways that would shape the early Cold War climate. In March 1947, Truman signed Executive Order 9835, commonly called the Loyalty Order, which established a broad program to investigate the loyalty of all federal employees and many applicants, a move he defended in public statements as necessary to reassure the public that there were no subversives in government. The text of the order, preserved in the National Archives, authorized the FBI and newly created loyalty boards to examine employees' political associations, writings, and even social circles for signs of disloyalty to the United States. The standard wasn't proof of espionage, but reasonable grounds for doubt, a vague phrase that Justice Department lawyers at the time warned could invite overreach, and that historians now see as a legal doorway to guilt by association. Congressional hearings, FBI files, and agency records from the late 1940s and early 1950s show that people were investigated, suspended, or dismissed not for proven acts, but for having once attended a left-wing meeting, subscribed to certain newspapers, or belonged to organizations later labeled subversive by the Attorney General's list, a document that ballooned to include dozens of groups, some of which had been legal and open just a few years earlier. The Truman Library's own collections include letters from staffers and citizens worried about the breadth of the program, and internal memos in which administration officials debated how to balance civil liberties with political pressure from Congress and the public, especially as Republicans accused Democrats of being soft on communism. Truman privately expressed concerns that witch hunters might abuse the system, and in later years he criticized the excesses of Senator Joseph McCarthy, but he never rescinded the loyalty program itself, and in practice it helped normalize the idea that federal employees' private beliefs and associations were grounds for official scrutiny. Historians disagree on how far Truman anticipated what his order would unleash. Some argue he was trying to contain conservative critics by taking a limited step, while others, citing diary entries and cabinet discussions, see him as more aware of the potential for abuse, but the numbers are stark. By the early 1950s, hundreds of workers had lost jobs or resigned under a cloud of suspicion, and thousands more had been investigated. High school accounts often mention McCarthyism as if it erupted suddenly from one senator's theatrics, yet the documented expansion of loyalty investigations under Truman's 1947 order shows that the infrastructure of fear was already being built, quietly, inside the executive branch before McCarthy ever waved a list on the Senate floor. 39. When Harry S. Truman is discussed in classrooms for his foreign policy, the spotlight almost always lands on the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but the way textbooks frame those decisions as a simple, tragic necessity to end the war often glosses over the depth of internal debate, the scale of civilian death, and the enduring moral arguments documented in military reports, diary entries, and post-war inquiries. In early August 1945, acting on recommendations from the Interim Committee and senior military and scientific advisors, Truman authorized the use of newly developed atomic weapons against Japan. The first bomb, dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, and the second on Nagasaki on August 9, killed an estimated 110,000 to more than 200,000 people, most of them civilians, with thousands more dying in the months and years that followed from burns, radiation, sickness, and cancers, according to studies by Japanese and international researchers. Truman's public statements at the time, preserved in the Truman Library, emphasized the goal of saving American lives and avoiding a bloody invasion of the Japanese home islands, and many U.S. military planners did expect enormous casualties from an invasion, though their estimates varied, with some internal projections far lower than the later, politically cited numbers of millions of deaths. Even during the war, there were differing views within the U.S. leadership. Wartime diaries and post-war testimony from figures like Admiral William Leahy, Truman's own chief of staff, and General Dwight Eisenhower reflect hindsight doubts about whether the bombings were militarily necessary given Japan's deteriorating position, ongoing conventional firebombing, and Soviet entry into the war, while other commanders and historians argue the shock of the atomic attacks hastened surrender and prevented even greater loss of life. The historical record is complicated further by documents from the Target Committee and the Frank Report, where some Manhattan Project scientists urged a demonstration of the bomb on an uninhabited area, and by post-war occupation surveys, such as the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, which concluded controversially that Japan might have surrendered before November 1 even without the atomic bombs or Soviet entry, a judgment many other scholars dispute as speculative. Modern historians do not agree on a single definitive answer about necessity. What they do agree on, based on declassified cables, minutes from Truman's meetings, and Japanese government records, is that the decision was made in a context where ending the war, intimidating the Soviet Union, and justifying the weapons development all played roles, their relative weight still argued over. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki today, casualty lists, survivor testimonies, and medical studies keep expanding our sense of what those few days meant for human bodies and communities. While in American civics lessons, the event is often compressed to a line about ending the war quickly. When you look beyond that line to the fuller archive, orders with Truman's signature, photographs of leveled neighborhoods, radiation dose reconstructions, and the still ongoing scholarly debates, you find that one of the most consequential acts ever taken by a U.S. president remains, even among experts, not just a military milestone, but one of the most morally contested decisions in the history of the office. 40. Dwight D. Eisenhower is usually remembered for highways and military-industrial complex warnings, but under his administration, the federal government ran a mass deportation campaign, with a name you probably didn't see in your history book, Operation Wetback. In 1954, responding to political pressure from Southwestern growers, nativist groups, and members of Congress who complained about so-called illegal aliens, Eisenhower approved a plan through the Immigration and Naturalization Service and the Border Patrol to dramatically increase roundups of undocumented Mexican migrants. The name itself, which appears in official memos and INS annual reports from the period, used a racial slur as a bureaucratic label. The operation, overseen in part by former Army General Joseph Swing, used military-style sweeps, roadblocks, and worksite raids across Texas, Arizona, and California, with agents often relying on appearance and accent rather than careful documentation checks, a practice described in contemporaneous civil rights complaints and later oral histories from Mexican-American communities. Government statistics from NOS records claim that approximately 1 million people were apprehended in the 1954 campaign, though historians point out that the numbers include many repeat arrests and that exact counts are contested. What's better documented in congressional testimony and newspaper accounts is that U.S. citizens and legal permanent residents of Mexican descent were caught up in the dragnets, sometimes pressured to voluntarily leave the country to avoid detention. Declassified Navy and Border Patrol reports describe how thousands of detainees were loaded onto buses, trains, and ships, including the transport ship Emancipacion, which carried people from Texas to Veracruz in overcrowded, unsafe conditions that one U.S. consul, compared to a wartime troop ship. At least some deaths from heat and exposure were reported in Mexican press coverage and later cited by scholars. Eisenhower himself rarely spoke publicly about the program beyond generic statements about law enforcement, and school narratives usually compress it into a line about tightening border controls, but the archival trail, INS directives, field reports, and diplomatic cables between Washington and Mexico City shows a far more disturbing picture.
Operation Wetback normalized large-scale sweeps targeting a specific ethnic group, blurred the line between undocumented migrants and citizens, and left many Mexican-American families with stories of parents or grandparents forced across a border they had once crossed legally or not crossed at all, under orders ultimately signed off by the same president, celebrated for building the interstates.
41. John F. Kennedy's presidency is often framed as a brief, idealistic Camelot cut short by assassination, but buried in the declassified cables and National Security Council minutes is a far less romantic episode. The decision to greenlight pressure on South Vietnam's leadership that set the stage for President Ngo Dinh Diem's overthrow and murder. By 1963, U.S. advisors had been in South Vietnam for years, and tensions between Diem's Catholic-dominated government and the majority Buddhist population had escalated into protests and self-immolations, scenes documented in embassy reports and shocking front-page photographs. Inside the Kennedy administration, State Department officials, CIA officers, and military advisors debated whether Diem was still a viable partner in the war against the Viet Cong. On August 24, 1963, while Kennedy was at his family compound in Hyannis Port, the State Department sent what became known as the Diem coup cable to U.S. Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge in Saigon, instructing him that if Diem refused to remove his powerful brother Ngo Dinh Nhu Ju, Washington would have to face the possibility that Diem himself cannot be preserved. Language preserved verbatim in the cable later declassified and published in the Pentagon Papers. The internal story of how that cable was drafted and cleared is messy. Some senior officials, including Defense Secretary Robert McNamara and CIA Director John McCone, later testified they had not fully approved its final form before it went out, while others at state argued Kennedy had signaled his consent in phone calls. Historians still debate how deliberate versus improvised the green light really was. What the record does show from White House tapes and Kennedy's own later comments is that he did not reverse the cable, and over the following weeks, U.S. contacts in Saigon maintained communication with South Vietnamese generals who were planning a coup, while Washington carefully avoided any firm instruction not to move ahead. On November 1, 1963, those generals overthrew Diem. The next day, Diem and En Hu Ju were killed in the back of an armored personnel carrier, a detail reported in embassy dispatches and confirmed in subsequent investigations. Kennedy, according to notes from aides and his own taped conversations, was visibly shaken by the assassinations and privately wondered whether different guidance might have avoided that outcome. But publicly, the administration treated the coup as an internal South Vietnamese matter. High school treatments of the Vietnam War often jump from advisors to full-scale American combat under Lyndon Johnson, with Diem's fall as a passing reference. Yet the paper trail of that August cable and the weeks that followed shows that under Kennedy, the U.S. had already crossed a line from backing a fragile ally to quietly midwaying a regime change whose bloody aftermath we then inherited. 42. When Lyndon B. Johnson is taught, the Vietnam section usually includes a few lines about the Gulf of Tonkin incident as the moment Congress authorized the war. But the simplified story of unprovoked attacks on U.S. ships leaves out how much the official version was already in doubt inside his own administration, and how later declassified evidence further undermined that certainty. On August 2, 1964, the destroyer USS Maddox, engaged in intelligence-gathering patrols close to North Vietnam's coast under a classified program called DeSoto, reported being approached and fired upon by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. This clash is documented in ship logs, NSA intercepts, and North Vietnamese accounts, which generally agree something happened, though they disagree on who provoked whom. 2 nights later, on August 4, Maddox and another destroyer, USS Turner Joy, reported what they believed was a second attack in bad weather. Radar and sonar operators picked up signals they interpreted as incoming torpedoes, and frantic messages were relayed up the chain of command. Within hours, Johnson went on national television describing open aggression on the high seas and used the alleged attacks to secure the Gulf of Tonkin resolution from Congress, a sweeping authorization that, as later Supreme Court arguments and congressional histories note, functioned like a blank check for escalating the war. But even as Johnson spoke with public certainty, doubts were already surfacing in classified communications. Cables between the Pentagon and the ships, and internal NSA summaries released decades later, show officers questioning whether the radar returns were simply bad weather or freakish readings, and by the next day the commander on the scene was expressing doubts that any torpedoes had actually been fired on August 4. A 2005 NSA historical study, declassified and posted on the agency's website, concluded that the second attack almost certainly did not occur as reported, and that signals intelligence had been selectively used and misinterpreted in 1964 to support the impression of a clear, repeated assault. Johnson's own taped phone calls, preserved by the LBJ library, capture him privately acknowledging uncertainty. At one point saying, "For all I know, our Navy was shooting at whales out there," even as he pressed Congress and the public to respond as if the facts were settled. Textbooks sometimes mention that the second incident is now disputed, but that phrasing can sound like abstract academic quibbling. The documents tell a starker story. A resolution that paved the way for the deployment of hundreds of thousands of American troops and the deaths of millions of Vietnamese rested in part on an event that U.S. intelligence analysts and naval officers were already deeply unsure about, with the president choosing to emphasize confidence in public while the classified record grew more ambiguous by the hour. 43. When people hear Tuskegee's syphilis study, they usually picture shadowy doctors in the 1930s, not decisions that stretch straight into the heart of the civil rights era and the Johnson administration. The study began in 1932 as a U.S. Public Health Service project in Macon County, Alabama, tracking the natural history of untreated syphilis in poor black sharecroppers who were told they were being treated for bad blood and offered free meals and burial insurance, a setup described in original PHS protocols and later summarized in the 1973 Ad Hoc Advisory Panel report, commissioned by the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. When penicillin was recognized as a highly effective cure for syphilis in the 1940s, and became widely available. Internal memos and correspondence now held at the National Archives show public health service officials explicitly deciding to withhold treatment from the men, so the experiment could continue, even as they arranged to prevent subjects from receiving therapy from local draft boards or health programs. By the 1960s, those files and annual updates were still moving through the federal bureaucracy. Johnson's broader war on poverty and Great Society health initiatives were expanding medical care for millions, yet within the same government, a racially targeted experiment that deliberately denied treatment was being quietly renewed year after year. The turning point came not from an internal review, but from a whistleblower, Peter Buxton, a young venereal disease investigator with the Public Health Service, filed formal protests starting in 1966 that were brushed aside, then finally took his concerns to the press when it became clear, as he later testified to Congress, that the agency had no intention of stopping the study. On July 25, 1972, Associated Press reporter Gene Heller published Buxton's leaked documentation, including letters and study rosters, revealing that hundreds of black men with syphilis had been left untreated for decades while being misled about their care. The story's details were so stark that within days, HEW officials announced the study's termination, and within months, congressional hearings in the Tuskegee Health Benefit Program were established. High school textbooks might reduce Tuskegee to a paragraph about unethical experiments, but the surviving paper trail PHS progress reports, Buxton's memos, and Heller's original reporting now archived in journalism collections, shows that the study did not die of internal conscience. It ended only when an insider's alarm and a reporter's front-page story forced a president-era bureaucracy to confront what it had been doing in secret for 40 years. 44. When Richard Nixon is linked with Cambodia in class, it's often a blurry line about expanding the war. But the documented reality of how his administration bombed a neutral country and hid it on paper is more precise and more unsettling. As declassified Air Force records and Pentagon histories show, starting in March 1969, Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, authorized a covert campaign called Operation Menu, in which B-52 bombers targeted suspected North Vietnamese and Viet Cong sanctuaries inside eastern Cambodia, a nation that had not formally entered the Vietnam conflict, and whose territorial integrity the U.S. had publicly pledged to respect. To conceal the strikes not only from the American public in Congress but from many within the military's own reporting system, the White House approved a dual bookkeeping scheme. Bomb runs over Cambodia were entered in a special, highly classified log while falsified coordinates inside South Vietnam were typed into the standard after-action reports, a practice documented in the Air Force's official History of the Strategic Air Command volumes and later described under oath by officers during congressional investigations. The State Department's Foreign Relations of the United States series and transcripts from the Senate's 1973 hearings on the bombing detail how the Joint Chiefs and a small circle of planners maintained this shell game for more than a year, routing target lists through back-channel communications and instructing field commanders to sign off on reports that did not match where the bombs actually fell. Between 1969 and 1973, including both the secret menu strikes and later more openly acknowledged operations, U.S. aircraft dropped hundreds of thousands of tons of ordnance on Cambodia, with casualty estimates for Cambodian civilians varying widely among scholars but consistently including tens of thousands of deaths and displacement and destruction that helped destabilize the countryside. Historians still debate the exact degree to which the bombing directly enabled the Khmer Rouge's rise, but there is broad agreement in the literature, from Ben Kiernan's work to U.S. Army War College studies, that the chaos and devastation created fertile ground for radicalization and recruitment. What's not really in dispute, because it sits in Pentagon archives and on reels of declassified tape, is that Nixon publicly portrayed himself as seeking peace while privately directing a bombing campaign in a neutral country and signing off on a system of falsified records designed to make sure Congress and the historical record would not easily see what had been done in his name. 45. Gerald Ford is often remembered, if he's remembered at all in school, as the calm, caretaking president who pardoned Nixon and tried to heal the country, but the last American combat operation in Southeast Asia under his watch, the Mayaguez incident, carries a grim arithmetic that's rarely spelled out. In May 1975, days after the fall of Saigon and the Khmer Rouge's capture of Phnom Penh, Cambodian forces seized the U.S. merchant ship SS Mayaguez in contested waters near the island of Koh Tang. Cabinet minutes and National Security Council records from the Ford Library show how the president, facing pressure to demonstrate American resolve after the chaotic Vietnam withdrawal, quickly approved a military rescue mission involving Marines, Air Force aircraft, and Navy ships. Declassified after-action reports and the official Marine Corps histories describe how U.S. commanders, working with incomplete intelligence, launched an assault on Koh Tang Island under the belief that the Mayaguez crew was being held there, while other elements moved to recapture the ship itself. In reality, Cambodian authorities had already taken the crew to the mainland, and according to State Department cables and later oral histories, were in the process of deciding to release them. During the chaotic firefight on Koh Tang, U.S. helicopters faced heavy fire from entrenched Khmer Rouge positions. 3 CH-53s were shot down or crashed, and dozens of Marines and Air Force personnel were killed or wounded, with 3 Marines, Lance Corporal Joseph Hargrove, Private First Class Gary Hall, and Private First Class Danny Marshall, left behind on the island, later listed as missing and presumed dead based on intelligence and POW/MAA investigations. In total, official Defense Department tallies list 41 American military personnel killed in the Mayaguez operation, including those lost in a related helicopter crash in Thailand, compared with 39 merchant sailors on the Mayaguez crew, all of whom were ultimately released alive by the Cambodians. Ford went before the cameras, and Congress portraying the mission as a clear-cut success that showed the United States would protect its citizens and stand firm in Asia, a framing repeated in some early histories. It was only as more documents were declassified and casualty lists scrutinized that scholars and investigative journalists highlighted the bitter irony that more Americans died in the rescue than were saved, and that some of the dead may have fallen in a battle fought after the ship's crew was already on its way home. 46. Jimmy Carter's presidency is usually remembered for its emphasis on human rights, Camp David, and solar panels on the White House roof. But in East Timor, the documentary record shows something much harder to square with that image. In December 1975, the Indonesian military invaded the former Portuguese colony of East Timor, and within months, U.S. Embassy cables and CIA situation reports, now available in State Department Foreign Relations of the United States volumes and National Security Archive collections, were describing widespread killings, forced relocations, and famine conditions as Indonesian forces consolidated control. The Ford and Kissinger green light for the initial invasion in 1975 has been widely discussed, but what often gets less attention in school is how, under Carter, U.S. arms and political cover continued to flow to Jakarta, even as internal reports painted a grim picture of what was happening on the ground. Declassified State Department memos show that in 1977 and 1978, as the Indonesian military launched major offensives in East Timor, Washington approved the resumption of weapons sales, non-lethal equipment on paper, but within a broader security relationship that included training and spare parts for systems already in use, while U.S. officials debated how to balance Carter's public human rights commitments with strategic ties to an anti-communist ally. Amnesty International reports and Australian diplomatic cables from the late 1970s, later corroborated by Indonesian Truth Commission findings, estimated that tens of thousands of Timorese died from violence, starvation, and disease during these years. U.S. consular and intelligence summaries sent back to Washington often echoed those concerns, noting large-scale displacement and heavy-handed counterinsurgency tactics. Congressional hearings in the late 1970s dragged some of this into the open, with members questioning how a president who had signed a human rights-oriented Arms Export Control Act could continue security assistance to a military accused of atrocities, and internal briefing papers preserved at the Carter Library show State Department officials carefully crafting language to defend limited sales while acknowledging serious abuses in private. Historians still debate the exact share of responsibility Washington bears for the scale of East Timor's suffering. Indonesian commanders made their own decisions, and not every weapon used was American, but there is broad agreement in the scholarly literature and among human rights researchers that Carter's administration, despite its rhetoric, did not use the leverage it had to halt military support or press hard for self-determination when it might have mattered most, leaving a paper trail in diplomatic files that contrasts sharply with the moral image often presented in civics class. 47. Ronald Reagan's name is usually attached to optimistic speeches about morning in America and winning the Cold War, but the Iran Contra affair, as laid out in thousands of pages of declassified cables, court records, and a joint congressional investigation, shows just how far his administration was willing to go around the rules to fund a dirty war in Central America. By the mid-1980s, Congress had passed a series of Boland amendments restricting U.S. support for the Nicaraguan Contras, a coalition of rebel groups fighting the leftist Sandinista government. The official line was that Washington would not provide military aid, while human rights abuses and mining of harbors were under scrutiny. Inside the National Security Council, however, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North and a small circle of officials pursued what the later Tower Commission and the independent counsel Lawrence Walsh's reports described as an off-the-books program, secretly facilitating arms sales to Iran, then officially designated a state sponsor of terrorism and under embargo, in the hope of both securing the release of American hostages in Lebanon and generating funds that could be diverted to the Contras. Declassified memoranda, NSC meeting notes, and testimony show how this network used front companies, Swiss bank accounts, and foreign intermediaries to move TOW missiles and spare parts to Tehran, with profits and third-country donations funneled back into weapons and supplies for Contra forces, all while telling Congress that no such military pipeline existed. When a cargo plane carrying supplies to the Contras was shot down over Nicaragua in October 1986 and Lebanese newspapers exposed the Iran arms deals the following month, the scheme unraveled. Televised hearings in 1987 walked through shredded documents, altered chronologies, and the famous "I was out of the loop" versus "I don't recall" formulations that framed Reagan's own knowledge. The Congressional Iran Contra report concluded that the operation had violated the spirit and letter of the law and represented a constitutional crisis over separation of powers, even as it stopped short of directly accusing the president of criminal conduct. Walsh's later prosecutorial narrative was blunter about obstruction and deception by senior officials, some of whom were convicted and later had their sentences commuted, or were pardoned by George H. W. Bush. High school textbooks often compress Iran Contra into a short sidebar, but the archival record, the NSC notebooks, the Swiss banking records, and the stacked volumes of hearing transcripts preserves an uncomfortable reality. Under a president celebrated for restoring faith in government, a secret foreign policy was run through shadow channels, precisely to get around the elected branch that was supposed to decide how and whether America went to war. 48. The story most people hear about Ronald Reagan and mental health focuses on his role as California governor in closing state hospitals, but there's a quieter federal decision from his presidency that reshaped community mental health care in ways that rarely make it into classrooms. In 1980, just before leaving office, President Jimmy Carter signed the Mental Health Systems Act, a law built on years of commission work and National Institute of Mental Health Research that aimed to strengthen a nationwide network of community mental health centers, expand services for people with severe mental illness, and coordinate federal, state, and local funding. Legislative histories and HEW planning documents preserved in the Carter Library show detailed blueprints for outreach, crisis intervention, and support services. When Reagan took office in 1981 on a platform of cutting federal spending and devolving power to the states, his first major budget package, the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, included provisions that effectively repealed large portions of the Mental Health Systems Act before most of its programs could fully launch, replacing them with a more limited block grant approach that sent reduced funds to states with far fewer federal standards attached. Congressional Budget Office reports and contemporaneous analyses by groups like the National Association of State Mental Health Program Directors documented sharp cuts on the order of 25 to 30% in some mental health line items, along with the elimination of specific federal grants that had been intended for staff training, children's services, and outreach to people at high risk of institutionalization or homelessness. Supporters of Reagan's changes argued, in floor debates and policy memos now stored in the Reagan Library and National Archives, that states would be more efficient and that the federal government needed to rein in deficits after years of growth. Critics countered that dismantling the Mental Health Systems Act without a comparable replacement would leave already fragile community systems, underfunded, pushing more people with serious mental illness into jails, emergency rooms, and the streets. Researchers still debate exactly how much of the homelessness crisis that became visible in the 1980s can be traced to these specific budget shifts versus broader economic and housing trends. But there is widespread acknowledgement in public health literature that the promise of a robust, federally supported community mental health infrastructure envisioned in 1980 was never realized. Instead, the paper trail of appropriations tables, veto threats, and reconciliation amendments from Reagan's first year in office records a pivotal moment when a national commitment to build out community-based care was narrowed and handed off, and many of the supports that might have made deinstitutionalization humane were pared back just as the need for them was becoming undeniable. 49. Ronald Reagan entered the White House in 1981 just as a strange new illness was beginning to show up in hospital charts, mostly among gay men in a few big cities, and the way his administration responded or didn't left a paper trail that looks very different from the heroic Cold War image many textbooks emphasize. The first formal report of what would later be called AIDS came from the CDC's Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report in June 1981, describing clusters of rare pneumonia and cancers, internal CDC memos, and early public health service alerts. Now archived at the National Library of Medicine and the Reagan Library, show scientists quickly warning that they were dealing with something deadly and fast-moving. By 1983, medical journals like the New England Journal of Medicine and The Lancet were publishing data on transmission and mortality, and federal health officials were asking for more money to research the virus and coordinate a national response. But White House budget documents and Office of Management and budget proposals from the early 1980s reveal repeated attempts to trim or slow walk requested increases. Reagan himself did not publicly use the word AIDS in a major address until 1987, after more than 20,000 Americans had already died, a delay documented in press conference transcripts and compiled by the Presidential AIDS Commission and later GAO timelines. For years, the disease was more likely to be the punchline of a briefing room joke than the subject of sustained presidential attention. Activists, including gay rights groups and organizations like ACT UP, argued in congressional testimony and open letters that the silence reflected moral judgment about who was getting sick, and contemporaneous coverage in the Washington Post and the New York Times reported tension between public health officials pushing for aggressive education campaigns, condom distribution and needle exchange studies, and political appointees wary of appearing to condone what they saw as immoral behavior. Reagan eventually appointed a presidential commission on the HIV epidemic in 1987, and by his final years in office, federal spending on AIDS had grown significantly, but those changes came after years of grassroots pressure, high-profile obituaries, and international alarm. Epidemiological modeling and retrospective analyses by the CDC and academic researchers suggest earlier, better-funded prevention and treatment efforts could have slowed the spread, saved lives, and reduced infections among later affected groups like women and hemophiliacs. Supporters of the administration argue that biomedical understanding was limited in the early years, and that blame should be shared across many institutions. Not just the White House, but the documentary record, the budget tables, the memos from frustrated health officials, the timeline of when the president finally spoke, shows a long period in which a rapidly escalating epidemic was met with caution, delay, and a conspicuous lack of public leadership from the very top. 50. Long before Ronald Reagan reached the presidency, the CIA had already run one of its most notorious Cold War programs, Project MKUltra, a sprawling series of experiments on mind-altering drugs and behavior control that remained largely hidden until a combination of document releases and congressional investigations in the 1970s pulled fragments into the open, even after agency leaders tried to erase the evidence. In 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered most MKUltra records destroyed as the program was being wound down, a fact detailed in later internal CIA histories and acknowledged during Senate hearings. What survived were boxes of financial documents and scattered technical files, the destruction order missed, buried in agency archives. In 1977, in response to Freedom of Information Act lawsuits and congressional pressure, the CIA turned over roughly 20,000 pages of those surviving MKUltra-related records, which, together with earlier Church Committee and Rockefeller Commission findings, formed the backbone of Senator Edward Kennedy's joint hearing on Project MKUltra, the CIA's program of research and behavioral modification. Those documents, now available through the National Archives and the CIA's own FOIA reading room, describe contracts with universities, hospitals, and prisons, the use of LSD and other drugs on unwitting subjects, and experiments on sleep deprivation, sensory isolation, and electroshock, often with only vague or misleading descriptions provided to institutional review boards of the time. The public record shows that some of these experiments were conducted on particularly vulnerable groups, psychiatric patients, prisoners, and people at the margins of society, raising serious ethical questions that later presidential bioethics commissions and historians like those writing in the Journal of the History of the Behavioral Sciences have grappled with. Reagan did not create MKUltra, and most of its core work had ended by the early 1960s. But during his presidency, the broader debate about intelligence oversight and past abuses, including MKUltra, resurfaced as the post-Watergate reforms collided with a renewed push for aggressive covert action. Declassified national security decision directives from the Reagan years, along with internal CIA and Justice Department correspondence, show administration officials arguing for more secrecy and flexibility in intelligence operations, even as older scandals like MKUltra were still being digested by the public and cited by critics as reasons for tighter controls. Some commentators, especially in popular media, spin MKUltra into stories about total mind control and programmed assassins, claims that go far beyond what the surviving documentary record supports. What is firmly established, even with much of the paper trail deliberately destroyed, is unsettling enough. A U.S. intelligence agency, with money approved through presidentially signed budgets, paid for experiments that gave drugs to people without their informed consent, tampered with their mental states, and then tried to wipe its own fingerprints off the files, leaving later generations to reconstruct the story from what Helms's shredders missed and what Congress and FOIA litigants managed to pry loose. You've just drifted through 50 uncomfortable corners of presidential history. And if your textbooks mentioned any of them at all, they probably got a sentence or two, stripped of context, sanded down until they no longer felt sharp. We saw early presidents speak soaring words about liberty, while owning human beings and signing laws that tightened slavery rather than loosening it, a gap you can still trace in plantation records, runaway slave notices, and the language of the Fugitive Slave Acts preserved in the statutes at large. We watched the country expand westward behind phrases like destiny and civilization, and then followed the paper trail that shows what that really meant. Indian removal orders, military reports from burned villages, treaties signed under duress and broken almost as soon as the ink dried. We saw Gilded Age and Progressive Era leaders talk about reform and modernity while their administrations quietly blessed corporate monopolies, strike-breaking, and experiments on people with no power to say no, all documented in court filings, company archives, and the quiet prose of government reports. We watched the First and Second World Wars from the other side of the podium, not as Hollywood epics or clean moral struggles, but as long sequences of internment orders, sedition prosecutions, intelligence operations, and chemical experiments that treated certain groups of people as expendable in the name of national security. We spent time in the Cold War, not just with the familiar headlines, but with declassified memos and cables showing presidents authorizing coups against elected governments, green-lighting secret bombing campaigns in countries Congress never formally declared war on, and funding death squads and dictators because they were ours. We saw how a single signature on an executive order could set the legal stage for entire communities to be rounded up and penned behind barbed wire. How an abstract phrase like containment translated into napalm, Agent Orange, and mass graves half a world away. How covert action turned into files labeled MKUltra, with missing pages in shredded boxes where the rest of the story should have been. We listened to presidents call for unity and law and order, while their justice departments tapped phones, opened mail, smeared civil rights leaders, and tried to break marriages and movements from the inside, all of it logged in FBI files and COINTELPRO directives that only surfaced when Congress finally forced them into the light. We watched the late 20th century through the slow-motion horror of an emerging epidemic, reading the timelines of when scientists first sounded the alarm, when budgets were requested and cut, when the word AIDS finally crossed a president's lips in public after thousands were already gone. Again and again, the pattern was the same, stirring rhetoric on the surface, and in the archives underneath, memoranda and meeting minutes that tell a much colder story about what choices were actually made and who was asked to bear the cost. None of this means every president was a cartoon villain, or that every decision was made with cruelty in mind. The documents show fear, confusion, bureaucratic inertia, genuine belief in bad ideas, and sometimes quiet dissent that never made it into the glossy biographies. It does mean that the story of the presidency is not just a line of portraits on a classroom wall, but a web of actions and omissions that changed real lives, often in ways that remain invisible if you only look at speeches and campaign slogans. Over time, the official version of events tends to smooth everything out. Failures become lessons, atrocities become controversial policies, and decisions that wrecked distant countries are reduced to a single neutral sentence about complex international circumstances. What changes that story is not a new myth, but new records, a box of declassified cables, a court-ordered document dump, a researcher in an archive turning a page no one has looked at in decades. Every generation gets a slightly different version of the same past, not because the events themselves changed, but because new pieces of the puzzle slipped out from behind security stamps, sealed envelopes, and family reputations. What your teachers left out wasn't always a deliberate lie. Often it was simply the version of history available at the time, trimmed to fit the space they had and the comfort level of the world they lived in. As more files are opened, more diaries unsealed, more tapes transcribed, the heroic silhouettes around our presidents grow more complicated, the edges less clean, the shadows harder to ignore. History doesn't really rewrite itself. It just fills in the blank spaces where we were once allowed to sleep through the uncomfortable parts, and asks very quietly how different the story looks now that the missing pages are finally on the table.